All right. I think we are going to go ahead and get started here. So I do thank everybody for coming out and attending the webinar. This webinar is going to be tips and tricks of laboratory and then a hint of industrial evaporation as well. So just getting right into it. My name is Donald Mabel III. I am the product specialist here at BUCHI. I handle various different product sets here, including, but not limited to, laboratory, industrial, parallel evaporation, spray drying, freeze drying, and chromatography. And on this page, you'll find my email address. So if you guys do have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to shoot me an email and I can answer any of your questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'll be able to find out someone who does. So getting right into the mix here, I'm going to kind of go over a little bit of the background, so the working principle, and then we'll hit some more advanced material and show you guys how to properly optimize your evaporation process. So just the working principle and a little bit of background of the distillation process period. So the first thing, the most important thing about any evaporation process, which even makes it possible, is adding energy to the equation. So you have to heat your sample. It's very common within the industry, and so adding heat to your sample is one of the more important parameters, because without energy into the system, evaporation cannot occur. The next parameter would be the boiling point. So the target boiling point that you want your sample to be, which would dictate the vapor pressure, the vapor temperature, and you do this by controlling the pressure of your system. And so we'll cover a little bit more about that going forward. And then the next would be your condenser temperature. So however much energy you put into the system, you must take it out as well. So it's very important that you match the energy that you have coming from your heating bath into your sample is proportional to how much energy is being taken out by the condenser. So whether it be a cold trap condenser or if you're using a recirculating chiller, making sure that's sufficient enough that it pulls all the energies out of your vapors so that you get nice and proper condensation. Because if you don't, what happens is all those vapors go into your pump and can make you either lose, precious solvent that you're trying to collect, or worse, it can damage your pump depending on the type of pump that you're using. So just a quick overview of the more important parameters of the distillation process and how everything works. So here at BUCHI, we have something called the Delta 20 rule. And so the Delta 20 rule means that to get a nice, good optimized system, we say you want a 20-degree difference between your heating temperature and your target boiling point or your vapor temperature. And then you want another 20-degree difference between your vapor temperature and your condenser temperature. So this gives a nice, good balance to your system so that all the energy that you're putting into the system, you're taking it out as well. So just a quick example, if you have, say, set your bath temperature to 60 degrees Celsius, that would mean you have adjusted your pressure so that your boiling point of whatever your solvent is 40 degrees Celsius. And then accordingly, you would set your cooling temperature to 20 degrees Celsius. And this gives you a nice, good equilibrium within the system and allows you to properly evaporate and condense the solvent into the receiving flask. But like I mentioned before, you do have to play around with the pressure and make sure you have nice, good control so that you can get that target boiling point and get the nice, efficient distillation that you require. So this is just to show you that the same applies to the industrial scale as well. So if you're using this to recycle a lot of solvents from a lot of different laboratories, you can easily do the same thing on an industrial unit so that you get nice, good, efficient collection of the solvent that you're trying to collect so that you can reuse it down the road. So one of the big things about the process is rotation. So the reason that we do rotate is so that we get nice, good heating, even heating throughout your system. So as you can see depicted in these pictures, if you don't rotate your flask, one, you limit your surface area, so you get increased surface area, and you get nice, good temperature equalization throughout your process. So you can actually reduce things like bumping, which I'll cover a little bit later, but it just speeds up your evaporation process overall because of the increased surface area. Without rotation, it's equivalent to putting your sample into a beaker and just heating it up. The next thing would be your flask angle. So this is another surface area thing. So if you actually get a flatter angle, you get more surface area of the flask so that you can have a lot more surface area for evaporation to occur, because evaporation only occurs at the surface of a liquid. Now, the one thing you do have to be careful of is that if you make your angle too flat, you do increase the chances of bumping your sample up into your condenser and possibly losing your sample as well. So it is better to get a flatter angle, but you also have to be conscious of the product that you're working with and make sure that that's something that's not so volatile that it can bump up into your condenser and thus cause you to have to take everything off, clean everything, and start all over. And so the next thing is your flask size. So flask size is very important, making sure you choose a big enough flask so that you can get nice, good evaporation by maximizing your surface area at the beginning of your run, but not choosing a flask so big that you're not able to retrieve your sample, or your sample is too thinly coated around the flask and it's not easy to collect. But as you can see from this chart, using the biggest flask that you have possible for your sample size can definitely increase the evaporation rate. And this all comes down to surface area once again. Obviously with larger flasks, you're going to have more surface area. So the importance of condenser loading is very crucial, because if you overload your condenser, so if your solvent level on your condenser goes over 3/4 of the condenser height, what can happen is you can overload it. And so that means anything over the 3/4, over that 3/4 height will be going into your pump or your vacuum source, and worse, be going out into the atmosphere. So especially if you don't have this in a hood, if you have it sitting on a bench top, you want to make sure that the condensate level inside your condenser is not over that 3/4 height level, so that you get nice, good condensation going down to receiving flask, and so you're protecting the user from breathing in all those harmful vapors. And then also choosing your condenser type is very important. So there are a lot of different condensers out there. I actually took this from our laboratory glassware guide. And so, make sure you choose the right condenser for your application is very important as well. So, most majority of people use vertical condensers for, a lot of the common solvents out there. But say if you're working with something that has a very, very low boiling point, you'll want to use a cold trap instead of a vertical, so that you can condense those vapors fast enough that they actually go from the vapor phase back into the liquid phase. Otherwise, what happens is they go straight into your pump, and like I said before, it goes out to the atmosphere. But if you also want to run reactions in your evaporation flask, so you have to do less sample transfer, you can do the reflux configuration. And then we also have a bunch of other configurations down here. I'm not going to get into them right now, but if you do have questions about them, please feel free to shoot me an email. We can talk about them a little bit more. But there are a lot of different glassware options out there, just depending on what application you're working with. And then going back to cooling capacity, so if you are using a vertical condenser or even an angle condenser, making sure you have a large enough chilling source with a high enough cooling capacity that it properly takes out all the energy out of your sample. And so the best way to pick the correct chiller is to look at the heating capacity of whatever you're working with. So let's say you wanted to run, and this is a common question, somebody wants to run multiple units on the same chiller. And what they'll try to do is just try and get the F305. But what happens is that as they're running both rotary evaporators on this chiller, it tends to heat up over time. And as it heats up over time, it doesn't properly cool down the vapors. And so all those vapors end up going into their pump. And so you'll see, the volume in their evaporation flask going down, but then they'll wonder where all these vapors are going because they're not seeing it in a receiving flask. And they'll wonder why their chiller isn't getting down. So, they'll set it to 5C, but for some reason it's only going as low as 15C. And that's because the cooling capacity of the chiller just isn't high enough. So that's why you would need to bump your chiller so that it can remain constant at that temperature. So these values listed here are given to you for 15 degrees C. So if you want to go, let's say, lower, so at 5C, these values are actually going to be lower. So a lot of people think that, if you just go to -20, That's actually going to give you better condensation. That's not necessarily the case. You can set it to 20, negative 20, negative 10, but what's going to happen is it's going to go up very, very quickly over time and not properly hold the temperature. So cooling capacity and heating capacity go hand in hand. Just like I said before, however much energy you put into the system, you must take it out as well. And so next comes one of the more important parts, and the whole reason we even use a rotary evaporator is to dictate the pressure. So creating a vacuum. And so this just kind of illustrates what happens when you do create a vacuum. You're reducing the amount of air particles inside the system so that the liquid can go into the vapor phase a lot easier. So just showing you the difference between atmospheric pressure and then having your sample under vacuum pressure. So these are just some quick examples of working with ethanol, but controlling the pressure to work for you or changing the temperature. So optimally, a lot of people want to work with 60-degree heating temperature. So that means you will want a target temperature for your vapor to be 40 degrees Celsius, which will mean that your pressure would be 175 millibar. Now, say you had a heat sensitive product and you couldn't heat it above CCC. You can only heat it, no more than 50 degrees C. Then what that means is you're going to have to lower all your parameters, but you're going to have to decrease your pressure as well so that you get that boiling point or your vapor temperature at the ideal value. So doing 45, 25, 5, you can easily do that. You just have to set your pressure to 77 millibar instead of 175. So that's important recommendations. There we go. Yeah, so make sure to ramp your pressure down as well. So one thing that can tend to happen is, especially if you're working with a really sensitive product, is people will just shoot the temperature down, but slowly ramping your pressure down instead of just decreasing it all the way down to the set value will actually help prevent things like bumping, like I mentioned before, and it will help contain all your product in the evaporation flask instead of it ending up all over the condenser. And then, like I mentioned before, using an adequate cooling capacity, and something else that I'll touch on a little bit later, use a beaker flask. So beaker flask, you can see in the picture, it is actually a removable top, and it allows you to retrieve your sample a lot easier than normal. So bumping. So bumping happens when you're basically not getting good temperature equalization within your sample. And so what happens is you get an explosive effect, and it sends your sample and the solvent flying everywhere. And usually you'll see this by seeing air bubbles tear through the surface of the liquid, and it basically looks like a little mini explosion inside your evaporation flask. And nobody likes this. The main way that I usually see this is by people using the glass stopcock on the back of the condenser for vacuum control. This is not ideal because it is a very inefficient way to control your vacuum, and it can cause bumping a lot easier than one would like. So that's why I say to prevent bumping, you want proper vacuum control. So using a controller with an aeration valve, or using a controller with a little solenoid, or even having a needle valve where you can actually see what pressure you're bringing into the system helps. But just having some form of vacuum control is tremendous, as opposed to just using the glass stopcock on the back of your unit. So having proper vacuum control, one, it gives you the target boiling point, so you have nice equalization within the unit, and so that you get nice, good condensation. But it increases the efficiency of the distillation as well. You get nice, good, reproducible results because it's giving you the exact same boiling point with the exact same parameters every single run. So you get the results that you expect. So, however long it takes you to run this run, that's how long it's going to take you to run it every single time, as long as you keep all the parameters the same. And you protect your vacuum source. So a lot of people, if they're not using the vacuum pump, they use a house vacuum as well. So, every vapor that gets through your system that's not being condensed by the condenser is going straight into the house vacuum source. So if you break the house vacuum source, not only does it break it for you, but it breaks it for everybody else that's using it. So that's where the proper condensation comes into play, and it's just really, really good thing to practice in any laboratory. And you also get controlled aeration. So controlled aeration, I'm not sure if you guys have seen this, but if you, let's say you manually aerate with the glass stopcock and you open it up and you send a bunch of air flying into your system, what can happen is your dry product that's in your evaporation flask, you get a nice burst of air and it can blow your sample all over the flask. You had nice, good concentrated sample in one spot, and you were going to retrieve it, but now you can't because now it's blown all over the place and you kind of have to wash it off the walls to properly get out the flask. So controlled aeration, nice, good, slow airstream coming into the flask so that your product doesn't get agitated towards the end of your process. Another thing that we have is a foam sensor. So a foam sensor, what it does is a photo detection, so it has a light sensor on it. And once the bubbles rise up in your flask and go around this foam sensor, it blocks the light from the sensor, and the sensor will trigger the aeration valve to aerate slightly so that it makes the foam die down. And this allows you to basically start your process and walk away from it without the risk of your sample foaming up into the condenser and you losing your product. Then there are also other things out there, and this was on the condenser page, but the high performance condenser, it actually has double the surface area of the regular vertical condenser. And this allows for larger cooling. So it actually increases your cooling capacity that you would have inside of a regular condenser. It allows for higher throughput. So you can actually bump up the temperature a little bit more to really get those vapors going over there, because the 3/4 level on this condenser is a lot higher than the other condenser. So you can have a lot more vapors going over into this condenser to get proper condensation. And this allows you to deviate from the Delta 20 rule a little bit. So if you wanted to, even if you have your temperature at, let's say, 5 degrees Celsius, you don't have to necessarily have your heat at 45. You can actually go up a little bit more to really send those vapors over there, because this can, there's enough retention time with the coils to pull all that energy out. The other thing is it protects your vacuum source more. It's a lot harder to overload this condenser than it is a normal condenser. So you protect your vacuum source at the same time because there's a minimum chance of overloading. And then, like I mentioned before, preventing vapors from leaking to the atmosphere so that whoever is using the instrument isn't breathing all those vapors in. And then, another hint, we have the exact same thing for the industrial unit. So if you are doing like big batch solvent recycling, or if you are working with solvents on this large of a scale, same thing still applies. And like, all the stuff that I talked about before as well, everything scales up to the industrial units, no problem. All the parameters still the same. You're still controlling the pressure. You're just working with larger volumes. So everything still applies. There is a high performance version for the R220 Pro. You still want to make sure that you have good vacuum control, make sure that you have good cooling capacity so that this larger amount of vapors aren't going onto your atmosphere. And then just want to touch on the beaker flask. So the beaker flask actually has a top on it that allows you to stick your whole hand in there. I'm not sure if anybody else has tried, but trying to scoop your product out of a 2440 joint is just not that ideal. It can be a little difficult, and it can be quite a hassle, especially if you're working with something sticky or even powder sometimes, depending on how fine they are when you're trying to scoop those out and they end up blowing all over the place. With this, you just take off the top, you stick your hand in there and just kind of scoop everything out, or you could even pour it out depending on what you're working with. And there are various different types of beaker flasks, different sizes. You just have to pick the one that's appropriate for your application, whether it be just simple evaporation, or if you're actually drying something, let's say a powder, or even an oil. And then one of the last things I want to touch on is minimizing contamination. So there's the picture of like a normal glass stopcock that I mentioned before. But in order to actually use that, you have to put grease on it. And there's actually a function called the backfeeding. There's a backfeeding method that allows you to introduce sample into the flask while your evaporation process is still running. And that happens by having a tube into your sample. You open this up to your sample and the vacuum actually draws it in. Well, you have to grease that glass joint so that you can get it to turn. So as your sample is coming into the system, it's actually coming in contact with that grease. So one way to reduce the amount of contamination is using the PTFE stopcock that I have listed here at the top. What this does is it eliminates grease because you don't need grease at all. There's just a little valve there and there's no contamination. So it just makes things extremely easy, and it keeps your product nice and clean so that when you do collect it or go to analyze it, you don't have to worry about grease appearing in your results. So just some common questions that I do get that I want to touch on. So what is the most important variable during the distillation process? As I mentioned before, the most important variable is going to be heat. So the temperature of your heating bath. Without heat, you can't get evaporation to occur. So, not only turn on the bath, but making sure it's at an optimal heat level so that you get nice, good, efficient distillation, and don't overdo it. So one, if your sample is temperature sensitive, that you don't cook it, and two, so that you don't shotgun your vapors past the condenser into your vacuum source. Another one is, what are the benefits of having, like all of BUCHI's equipment? Everything's integrated. So when you're using our vacuum pump, when you actually get to the set value, it actually slows down. What can tend to happen is if you have a vacuum pump that's running, 100% all the time, and let's say the valve doesn't close, or if you're doing it manually with like a needle valve or something, let's say you overdo it, you can easily, there's just that room for error for your sample to bump up into the condenser. With our vacuum source, it actually slows down to almost the point of stopping when it gets to a set value, so that even if if it for some reason you were doing manual control, you actually there's no chance for it to actually overshoot the value, because once it gets to the set value, it actually slows down and almost shuts off. And then it's just higher efficiency and lower energy costs as well. But the better vacuum control is the biggest thing. And then, so this is a common question that people do call in all the time. Why won't my solvent condense in the condenser? Well, there's one of two reasons. One, your pressure is not low enough. So either you have a leak in the system that you need to figure out, or your pump isn't strong enough, or your whatever pressure that you had set that you thought might be the right value is their incorrect value. Or the other reason is you have insufficient cooling capacity. What can happen is you'll see the level of your sample reduce going down, but you won't see any solvent in the condenser. This means that all that stuff is going over into your pump. So your chiller is not strong enough. So you need to either get a better chiller, or if you're using, let's say, a cold trap, you need to refill it, put some more dry ice in there, because it's warmed up too much that you're not actually getting condensation. So that's all I have for you guys today. If anybody else has any questions, please ask now. I'll hold a couple more minutes for you guys to ask questions. And I just want to put my email here as well. So if you guys do have any questions after everything is over, please feel free to reach out to me again, and I can help you answer your questions. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in. So I do thank everybody for attending the webinar. If you, once again, do have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and everybody have a great day.